A couple smiles for a 1920s photo. 100 years later, their grandson zooms in and turns pale. The old photograph trembled slightly in Eli's hands as he positioned it under the magnifying glass. At 29, he had developed steady fingers from years of historical restoration work, but today something felt different. The Wells family centennial exhibit was just 3 weeks away, and he had promised his mother he would digitize and restore all the family photographs dating back to the 1920s. "Just get the important ones done, sweetheart," his mother Claire had said while dropping off 3 dusty boxes filled with memories. Grandpa Henry and Grandma Margaret would have loved to see their legacy celebrated like this. Eli smiled at the memory as he carefully placed his grandparents' 1923 wedding photograph on the restoration table. The black and white image showed a classic scene: Henry Wells, tall and distinguished in his mourning coat, standing beside his radiant bride Margaret, whose beaded dress caught the light beautifully. They were positioned in front of the old St. Michael's Church, both wearing the kind of genuine smiles that spoke of real happiness, not just camera obligation. He had seen this photograph countless times growing up. It hung in his grandparents' living room until they passed away when he was 15, then moved to his mother's mantelpiece. But tonight, working under the bright LED lights of his home studio, Eli was seeing it with the trained eye of a professional historian and digital restoration specialist. The scanning process was routine: 1200 dpi resolution, careful cleaning of dust spots, minor contrast adjustments. But as the high-resolution image filled his computer screen, Eli found himself leaning closer. There was something about the composition that seemed off. He zoomed into 200% magnification, then 400%. The image quality remained sharp, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. Margaret's pearl necklace showed individual imperfections. Henry's boutonniere displayed tiny pollen specks. The church's stone facade revealed intricate carved details. And then Eli saw it. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the screen. There, standing slightly behind and to the left of his grandparents, partially obscured by Margaret's flowing veil and the shadows cast by the church entrance, was the unmistakable figure of a child. "What the hell?" Eli whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet studio. The child appeared to be around 3 or 4 years old, wearing what looked like a sailor suit typical of the 1920s. The figure was oddly blurred, as if it had moved during the long exposure time cameras required back then. But what made Eli's skin crawl was the child's face, pale, almost translucent, with dark eyes that seemed to stare directly into the camera lens. Eli rubbed his eyes and looked again. The figure was still there. He had worked with thousands of old photographs in his career. He knew about double exposures, light leaks, and darkroom accidents. He understood how chemicals could create phantom images, how shadows could play tricks. But this was different. This looked like an actual person, a child who had been standing there when his grandparents posed for their wedding portrait. His hands shaking slightly, Eli grabbed his phone and speed-dialed his mother. "Eli? It's almost midnight, honey. Is everything okay?" Claire's voice was thick with sleep. "Mom, I need to ask you something about Grandpa Henry and Grandma Margaret." Eli stared at the image on his screen, zooming in further on the mysterious child. "Did they ever mention having any other children? Maybe one that died young?" There was a long pause. "What?" "No, sweetheart. You know the family history. They only had your father, Robert." "Why would you ask such a strange question? I'm looking at their wedding photo right now, and there's a child in it. Standing right behind them. A little boy in a sailor suit." Claire laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, Eli. You're working too late. It's probably just a shadow or a reflection. You know how those old cameras could be tricky." "Mom, I'm looking at a 400% magnification on a professional-grade scanner. This isn't a shadow. This is a person." Another pause. "Well, maybe it was someone else's child at the wedding. A nephew or a neighbor's kid who wandered into the shot. You know how children can be." Eli frowned. Something in his mother's tone didn't sit right. She sounded defensive? Nervous? But Mom, look at the positioning. This child is standing with them, like family. And the way the photo is framed, it looks intentional. Eli, stop this nonsense. Your grandparents never mentioned any other children, and I would have known. Now get some sleep and stop letting your imagination run wild. The line went dead. Eli stared at his phone, then back at the computer screen. His mother's reaction had been strange. In all his years of family research, she had never been dismissive about historical details. She usually loved discussing family history and was proud of their well-documented lineage. He decided to call his Aunt Patricia, his father's sister. If anyone would know about family secrets, it would be Pat. She had always been the keeper of family stories, the one who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every piece of gossip. Patricia Wells speaking. His aunt's voice was crisp and alert despite the late hour. Aunt Pat, it's Eli. I'm sorry to call so late, but I'm working on the family photos for the centennial, and I found something strange. Oh, wonderful! I can't wait to see what you've discovered. Your grandparents had such a rich photographic history. That's just it. I'm looking at their wedding photo, and there's a child in it. A little boy, maybe 3 or 4 years old, standing right behind them. Did Grandpa Henry and Grandma Margaret ever mention having another child? The silence that followed was deafening. Eli could hear his aunt's breathing, but she said nothing for nearly 30 seconds. Aunt Pat? Are you there? Eli, that's impossible. Your grandparents only had your father. There was never any other child. But her voice had changed. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. Can you email me the photo? She asked quickly. Maybe I can help identify who it might be. Of course. Eli's fingers moved across the keyboard as he spoke. I'm sending it now. Take a look at the area behind Grandma Margaret's left shoulder. He heard the familiar ping of an email notification through the phone. Let me just... Patricia's voice trailed off. Then, sharply, Eli, this is clearly a photographic error. Maybe damage to the negative or some kind of chemical stain. You're seeing things that aren't there. And Pat, I'm a professional photo restorer. I know the difference between damage and an actual person. Well, you're wrong this time. Her tone had become almost harsh. There was no other child. End of discussion. And she hung up. Eli sat back in his chair, staring at the computer screen. Both his mother and aunt had reacted strangely to his discovery. Their denials felt too quick, too defensive. They weren't just saying they didn't know about another child. They were actively shutting down the conversation. He looked back at the mysterious figure in the photograph. The child's face, though blurred, seemed somehow familiar. Those dark eyes, the shape of the nose. There was something about the features that reminded him of his own family. Eli made a decision. Tomorrow, he would start digging deeper. If his grandparents had another child, a child whose existence had been somehow erased from family memory, he was going to find out why. The clock on his computer showed 12:47 a.m., but Eli couldn't sleep now. He spent the next hour examining every pixel of the wedding photograph, taking notes, making enhancement adjustments. The more he studied the image, the more convinced he became that this was no photographic accident. Someone had been standing there that day in 1923. A child who was somehow connected to his family. A child whose story had been buried for nearly a century. As he finally prepared to shut down his computer, Eli took one last look at the mysterious figure. In the harsh glow of the LED light, the child's pale face seemed to stare back at him with an expression that was both sad and hopeful. "Who are you?" Eli whispered to the screen. "And what happened to you?" The digital image, of course, provided no answers. But Eli Wells was a historian, and historians were trained to uncover buried truths. Whatever secret his family had been keeping for 100 years, he was going to expose it. Even if it meant discovering something they had desperately wanted to keep hidden. 3 sleepless nights had passed since Eli's discovery, and the mysterious child's face haunted his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those dark, blurred features staring back at him from the wedding photograph. His mother and aunt's reactions had only fueled his determination to uncover the truth. Saturday morning found Eli standing in his parents' garage, surrounded by towers of dusty storage boxes his mother had reluctantly allowed him to examine. "Just put everything back exactly where you found it," Claire had said, avoiding eye contact. "And don't make a mess." The first few boxes contained the usual family detritus: old tax documents, Christmas decorations, his father's high school yearbooks. But in the fourth box, wedged beneath a stack of his grandmother's recipe cards, Eli found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. The brass clasp had turned green with age, and when Eli opened it, the familiar scent of lavender and old paper filled his nostrils. On the first page, in elegant cursive script, were the words, "Margaret Wells, Private Thoughts, 1924. His hands trembling with excitement, Eli carefully turned the yellowed pages. Most entries were mundane: observations about the weather, mentions of church socials, complaints about the rising cost of groceries. But as he read deeper into 1924, a pattern began to emerge. His grandmother's handwriting became more erratic, her entries shorter and filled with an undercurrent of sadness. Then, on a page dated March 15, 1924, Eli found it. "Henry came home early from work today. He found me crying again in the kitchen, and I couldn't explain why the sound of children playing in the street makes my heart feel like it's breaking. He doesn't understand how I can miss little Tommy's laughter echoing through the house. Sometimes I swear I can still hear his footsteps running up and down the stairs." Eli's breath caught. Tommy. The name his mother and aunt claimed never existed. He flipped through more pages, searching desperately for additional mentions. 3 weeks later, another entry. "Mrs. Henderson from next door brought over a casserole today. She meant well, but when she mentioned how quiet our house has become, I had to excuse myself. If only she knew how the silence screams at me. Tommy's room feels like a tomb." And then, in May, "Henry insists we must stop talking about it. He says dwelling on the past will only make things worse, but how can I forget? How can I pretend that Tommy never existed? Yet Henry is probably right. We must think of the future, of the children we might still have." Eli's mind raced. Tommy wasn't just mentioned, he had lived with his grandparents. He had a room in their house. But what had happened to him? Digging deeper into the box, Eli found a manila envelope filled with loose photographs. Most were standard family portraits, but tucked between 2 pictures of his grandfather's hardware store, he discovered something extraordinary: a small, faded postcard with a picture of Niagara Falls on the front. He flipped it over, and his blood ran cold. In his grandfather's careful handwriting were the words, "To our boy, wherever you are. We think of you every day and pray you are safe and happy. All our love, Papa and Mama. 1925. The postcard had never been mailed. There was no address, no stamp. It was as if his grandfather had written it as a message to the void, a prayer sent to nowhere. Eli's hands were shaking now. This wasn't just about a mysterious child in a photograph anymore. This was about a family member who had been systematically erased from their history. But why? He spent the next hour going through every remaining item in the storage boxes, looking for any additional clues about Tommy. In his grandmother's jewelry box, he found a small silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph, so faded it was barely visible, of a toddler with dark hair and serious eyes. The same eyes Eli had seen in the wedding photograph. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in tissue paper, was something that made Eli's heart stop: a small child's shoe. It was brown leather, no bigger than his palm, with tiny scuff marks on the toe. Pinned to the tissue paper was a note in Margaret's handwriting. Tommy's first walking shoes, March 1922. The pieces were starting to come together, but they created more questions than answers. Tommy had clearly existed. The diary entries, the postcard, the locket, the shoe all proved that. He had been part of the family, loved and remembered. But something had happened to him, something that had caused his grandparents such pain that they eventually stopped speaking about him entirely. Eli carefully photographed every piece of evidence with his phone, then packed everything back exactly as he had found it. But as he prepared to leave, one thought kept nagging at him. If Tommy had been around 3 or 4 years old in the 1923 wedding photograph, and his grandmother had written about him in 1924, what had happened between then and the complete silence that followed? On his way home, Eli made a detour to the Delhi Public Library. If Tommy Wells had been born and lived in the area, there might be records, birth certificates, school enrollment, even newspaper mentions. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Patel, was helpful but initially found nothing under the name Thomas Wells. But when Eli mentioned the approximate birth year of 1921, her expression changed. "Wait," she said, adjusting her glasses and typing rapidly on her computer. "Here's something. Thomas Henry Wells, born April 3, 1921. Parents listed as Henry James Wells and Margaret Rose Wells." Eli's heart pounded. "Is there anything else? School records? A death certificate?" Mrs. Patel frowned at the screen. "That's strange. The birth record is here, but there's no death certificate in our system. No school enrollment records either. It's as if he just disappeared from the official record after 1921. Could you check newspaper archives from the early 1920s? Maybe there was an accident or... I'll need to search the microfiche for that period," Mrs. Patel said. "It'll take some time. Can you come back Monday?" Eli nodded, his mind already racing ahead. As he drove home, one question dominated his thoughts. How does a child simply vanish from all official records? And why had his family chosen to pretend Tommy Wells had never existed? The mystery was deepening, and Eli knew he was only scratching the surface of a secret that had been buried for nearly a century. The drive to his grandparents' old house took Eli through the quieter part of Delhi, where colonial era homes sat behind overgrown hedges and rusted iron gates. The Wells family had owned 47 Maple Street for over 80 years, but it had stood empty since his grandmother's death 5 years ago. His mother kept paying the property taxes, claiming she wasn't ready to sell, but Eli suspected there were other reasons for her reluctance to let it go. The house looked smaller than he remembered from childhood visits, its white paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. The wraparound porch where he used to play with toy soldiers now sagged under the weight of fallen branches. But the key was still hidden under the loose brick by the front steps, exactly where his grandfather had always kept it. The door opened with a prolonged creak that echoed through the empty hallway. Eli stepped inside, breathing in the musty smell of abandonment mixed with the faint remnants of his grandmother's rose perfume. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows, and his footsteps on the hardwood floors sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. He had come here with a purpose, to search for any remaining traces of Tommy that his family might have overlooked. If a child had lived in this house, there had to be evidence somewhere, a forgotten toy, a mark on a doorframe, something that couldn't be easily erased from memory. The ground floor revealed nothing unusual. The living room, dining room, and kitchen looked exactly as they had when his grandmother was alive, just covered in years of dust and neglect. But as Eli climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, he noticed something odd about the hallway layout. According to his childhood memories, there should have been 3 bedrooms upstairs: his grandparents' master bedroom, his father's old room, and a guest room his grandmother used for sewing. But as he paced off the distances, the measurements didn't add up. There was at least 8 feet of space unaccounted for between his father's room and the sewing room. Intrigued, Eli examined the hallway walls more carefully. The wallpaper pattern was consistent, but there was a subtle difference in one section. The paper looked newer, as if it had been replaced or repaired. He pressed against the wall and felt it give slightly, different from the solid plaster elsewhere. His heart racing, Eli went back downstairs and found his grandfather's old toolbox in the basement. Armed with a flashlight and a pry bar, he returned to the suspicious section of wall. What he discovered made his hands tremble. Behind the wallpaper was a door, not a full-size door, but a child-sized opening, painted over and sealed years ago. The hinges were still visible once he scraped away the layers of paint and paper. With careful pressure from the pry bar, the door creaked open to reveal a small room, no bigger than a large closet. Eli squeezed through the opening and shone his flashlight around the space. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was a child's bedroom, perfectly preserved like a shrine. A tiny bed with a faded quilt sat against one wall. Wooden toy soldiers were arranged in battle formation on a small table. A rocking horse, its paint worn from use, sat motionless in the corner. And covering the walls were children's drawings, crude crayon sketches of stick figures labeled Mama, Papa, and Me. But it was what he found on the small nightstand that made Eli sink to his knees in shock. A wooden toy boat, intricately carved with tiny details, sat next to a child's picture book. And carved into the base of the boat, in careful block letters, were the initials TW. Beside the boat was an envelope, yellowed with age but still sealed. Eli's hands shook as he carefully opened it, revealing a letter written in his grandmother's flowing script. Asterisk. My dearest Henry, I cannot bear to throw away Tommy's things, but I cannot bear to look at them either. Perhaps someday, when the pain is not so fresh, we will be able to remember him with joy instead of this terrible guilt. I keep thinking about that afternoon by the river, how we argued about letting him play so close to the water. If only I hadn't turned away to scold you about your pipe smoking. If only we hadn't been so distracted by our petty disagreement. The police say they searched everywhere, but I know in my heart we will never see our little boy again. The current was so strong that day, and he was so small. I pray he didn't suffer, Henry. I pray he found peace quickly. We must be strong for each other, and for any children God might still bless us with. But I cannot speak of this anymore. The neighbors' whispers are already too much to bear, and I see the judgment in their eyes. They think we were careless parents, that we failed to protect our own child. Perhaps they are right. Your loving wife, Margaret. P.S. I am sealing his room tonight. No one must know of this place. We must learn to live with the silence, for speaking of Tommy only makes the pain unbearable. Asterisk. Eli's eyes filled with tears as he read his grandmother's words. The truth was finally becoming clear. Tommy hadn't just disappeared from the records. He had died in a tragic accident at the river. His grandparents, consumed by guilt and grief, had literally walled off his memory, sealing his room and vowing never to speak his name again. But there was still one piece missing from the puzzle. How had Tommy appeared in their wedding photograph if he had died sometime after 1923? The timeline didn't make sense. Eli carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, along with the small wooden boat. As he prepared to leave the hidden room, his flashlight beam caught something else, a small framed photograph on the floor beside the bed, face down. He picked it up and turned it over. It was the same wedding photograph he had been restoring, but this copy was different. In this version, Tommy was clearly visible, standing between his parents, with a bright smile. Someone had carefully painted over him in the copy that had been displayed in the family home, making him appear as just a ghostly blur in the background. The realization hit Eli like a physical blow. His grandparents hadn't just erased Tommy from their memories. They had literally erased him from their photographs, painting over his image to make it appear he was never there at all. But they couldn't bring themselves to throw away this one true copy. It had been hidden here in Tommy's room, a secret testament to a child whose existence had been deliberately obscured by grief and guilt. As Eli finally emerged from the hidden room, he understood that he wasn't just uncovering a family mystery. He was resurrecting a lost soul whose story deserved to be told. The drive back from his grandparents' house felt like a journey through time. Eli clutched the wooden boat and the original wedding photograph, his mind reeling from Margaret's devastating letter. But questions still gnawed at him. If Tommy had drowned in 1924, why had the entire neighborhood seemed to forget he ever existed? How had his grandparents managed to erase a child so completely from local memory? The answer came from the most unexpected source. Mrs. Evelyn Chin lived in the house directly across from his grandparents' old property. At 93, She was the oldest resident on Maple Street and had been there since the 1940s. Eli had seen her tending her garden during his childhood visits, a tiny woman with sharp eyes who seemed to know everything that happened in the neighborhood. When Eli knocked on her door that evening, Mrs. Chen opened it immediately, as if she had been expecting him. "Your little Bobby Wells boy," she said without preamble, her voice still strong despite her age. "I saw you coming out of the old Wells house today. Found what you were looking for." Eli was startled by her directness. "Mrs. Chen, I'm researching my family history, and I've discovered some unusual information about my grandparents. I was wondering if you might remember anything about them from when you were younger." Mrs. Chen's expression grew somber. She invited him in and served tea in delicate china cups, her movements deliberate and careful. "I moved here in 1943, just after I married my husband," she began, settling into a worn armchair. "The Wells house was already known as the quiet house on the street. Your grandparents kept to themselves, rarely spoke to neighbors, attended church but never socialized afterward." Eli leaned forward. "Did you ever hear about them having another child? Before my father was born?" Mrs. Chen's teacup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "So you found out about the little boy." The confirmation hit Eli like a physical blow. "You knew?" "Child, everyone knew. But we also knew never to speak of it." Mrs. Chen's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Your grandmother Sarah, she lived next door to the Wellses back then. She told me the whole story when I first moved here. Said it was the neighborhood's unspoken rule, never mention the Wells boy who died." Eli's hands tightened around his teacup. "What exactly did she tell you?" Mrs. Chen rose slowly and walked to an old secretary desk in the corner. She pulled out a small notebook, its pages yellow with age. "I wrote it down," she said, returning to her chair. "Sarah was getting old even then, and I was afraid the story would die with her. She made me promise to never repeat it while your grandparents were alive, but now—" She opened the notebook and began to read in a steady voice. "It happened in the summer of 1924. Little Tommy Wells, not quite 3 years old, was playing by Miller's Creek while his parents were having one of their arguments. Henry wanted to move to the city where his brother had found work, but Margaret refused to leave her mother. They were so caught up in their fighting that they didn't notice Tommy had wandered too close to the water." Mrs. Chen paused, her fingers tracing the handwritten words. "Sarah said she heard Margaret scream from 3 houses away. By the time the neighbors arrived, Henry was already in the water, diving again and again, but the current had taken the child downstream. They searched for days. The whole town searched." Eli felt his throat tighten. "Did they ever find him?" 2 weeks later, about 5 miles downstream. But by then..." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Sarah said it broke them completely. Margaret blamed herself for arguing instead of watching. Henry blamed himself for bringing up the move that day. The guilt nearly destroyed their marriage. But why did everyone agree to forget about him?" Mrs. Chen closed the notebook carefully. "Because of what happened at the funeral." Eli waited, his heart pounding. Margaret had what people then called a nervous breakdown. She stood up in the middle of the service and started screaming that it was all their fault, that they had finished their own child through their carelessness and selfishness. She collapsed right there in front of the whole congregation. Mrs. Chen's voice grew even softer. The doctor said she needed complete rest, no reminders of the tragedy. Henry made a decision that seemed merciful at the time. He asked everyone to stop mentioning Tommy's name, to let Margaret heal without constant reminders of their loss. And people just agreed to that. Times were different then, child. Mental health wasn't understood the way it is now. The community thought they were being kind by helping the Wellses forget. They removed Tommy's name from church records, stopped including him in family discussions, even avoided mentioning him in the local newspaper's anniversary coverage. Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her eyes intense. But Sarah said the silence made it worse, not better. Margaret never truly healed because she could never properly grieve. The guilt festered in that house like an infection. When your father Robert was born in 1926, they poured all their protective energy into him, But they could never speak about the brother he never knew he'd had. Eli understood now. The neighborhood's conspiracy of kindness had become a prison of silence. His grandparents had been trapped in their grief, unable to process Tommy's death because acknowledging it meant facing their guilt. "Mrs. Chin," Eli said quietly, "did Sarah ever say why my grandparents painted over Tommy in their wedding photograph?" The old woman nodded sadly. "Margaret did that herself, around 1930. Sarah saw her burning photographs in the backyard one day, all except the wedding picture. But she couldn't bring herself to burn that one, so she painted over Tommy instead. Made him invisible but not gone." As Eli prepared to leave, Mrs. Chin took his hand with surprising strength. "That little boy deserves to be remembered properly," she said. "The silence was never about protecting him. It was about protecting the adults who couldn't face their own pain. But pain doesn't disappear when you refuse to speak its name. It just grows stronger in the darkness." Walking back to his car, Eli felt the weight of a century's worth of buried grief. Tommy Wells hadn't just died in 1924. He had been finished twice, first by the river and then by the silence that followed. Sunday morning found Eli standing on his parents' front porch, Tommy's wooden boat clutched in one hand and the original wedding photograph in the other. He had barely slept, his mind churning with everything he had learned. The weight of his family's buried secret felt almost unbearable, but he knew that breaking a century of silence required more than just revelation, it demanded compassion. His mother answered the door in her gardening clothes, dirt smudged on her cheek. "Eli? I wasn't expecting you today. Your father's watching the cricket match if you want to." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the items in his hands. Her face went pale. "Where did you get those? We need to talk, Mom. All of us. Can you call Aunt Patricia?" Claire's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Within 20 minutes, Patricia arrived, her usual composed demeanor cracking the moment she saw Tommy's toy boat sitting on the coffee table. "How dare you go through their private things?" Patricia said, her voice sharp with panic. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried, Eli." "Are they?" Eli asked gently, settling into the armchair across from his mother and aunt. His father, Robert, had joined them, confusion evident on his weathered face. "Dad, did you know you had an older brother?" Robert's eyes widened. "What? That's impossible. My parents would have." "His name was Tommy," Eli continued softly. "Thomas Henry Wells, born April 3, 1921. He drowned in Miller's Creek when he was 3 years old, while Grandpa Henry and Grandma Margaret were having an argument about moving to the city." The silence that followed was deafening. Claire buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Patricia stood abruptly, pacing to the window with her back to the room. "You don't understand," Claire whispered through her tears. "You don't understand what this did to them." "Then help me understand," Eli said, his voice gentle but firm. "Help me understand why a little boy who was loved and remembered had to be erased from our family's story." Patricia turned from the window, her eyes blazing. "Because some pain is too great to bear. Because talking about it only makes it worse. Your grandmother nearly lost her mind after Tommy died. The guilt was eating her alive. So instead, she lived with it silently for 60 years? Eli pulled out Margaret's diary and the letter he had found in Tommy's room. "I found these, Aunt Pat. Grandma never forgot about Tommy. She carried that pain with her every single day." Robert reached for the diary with trembling hands. As he read his mother's words about Tommy's laughter, tears began streaming down his face. "I had a brother," he whispered. "All these years, and I had a brother. The silence was supposed to protect you," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "Mother made us promise when you were born. She said you deserved to grow up without the shadow of tragedy hanging over the house. But it was there anyway, wasn't it?" Eli asked gently. "I remember how Grandma would sometimes stare out the window for hours, how she'd get this distant look in her eyes. I remember how she never wanted anyone playing near water, how she'd panic if we got too close to the neighbor's pool." Patricia sank back into her chair, the fight going out of her. "She used to have nightmares," she admitted quietly. Even when we were adults, visiting for holidays. She'd wake up screaming Tommy's name, and Grandpa Henry would hold her until she stopped shaking. The wedding photograph, Robert said, holding up the original copy where Tommy stood clearly visible between his parents. Why would she paint over him? Eli explained about finding the hidden room, about Margaret's letter and her desperate attempt to preserve some memory while still maintaining the fiction that Tommy had never existed. She was trapped, Eli said softly. Trapped between her love for Tommy and her guilt about his death. The community thought they were helping by agreeing to forget, but it just made her isolation complete. Claire wiped her eyes and looked at her son with a mixture of pride and pain. What do you want from us, Eli? Tommy's been gone for 100 years. What's the point of dragging this all up now? I want to give him back his place in our family, Eli said simply. I want Dad to know he had a big brother who played with toy soldiers and drew pictures of his mama and papa. I want us to include Tommy's name in the family records at the Centennial exhibit. I want his story to be told with love instead of shame. The room fell quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Robert spoke. Tell me about him, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me about my brother. And so Eli did. He told them about Tommy's drawings on the bedroom walls, about the carved wooden boat, about the tiny shoes that showed he had taken his first steps in that house. He read passages from Margaret's diary that spoke of Tommy's bright smile and infectious laughter. As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable happened. The 3 generations of Wells family members began to share their own memories and observations. How Margaret would sometimes set an extra place at Christmas dinner. By mistake. How Henry had kept a small toy soldier in his pocket until the day he died. How both grandparents would always pause when they passed the playground. They never stopped loving him, Patricia said finally. They just didn't know how to carry that love without the guilt. Claire reached for Tommy's wooden boat, holding it carefully in her palms. You know what we should do? She said, looking up at Eli with red but determined eyes. We should find Miller's Creek. We should take this boat to the place where our little boy played, and we should finally say goodbye properly. For the first time in a century, the Wells family was ready to welcome Tommy home. 3 weeks later, the Delhi Community Center buzzed with the excitement of the Wells family's centennial celebration. Tables laden with historical photographs, documents, and memorabilia filled the main hall, and 4 generations of Wells descendants had gathered to honor their heritage. But for Eli, standing beside the central display, this day held a deeper significance than anyone else could imagine. The morning had begun at Miller's Creek. The 4 of them, Eli, his parents, and Aunt Patricia, had walked along the overgrown path to the spot where Mrs. Chen remembered the tragedy occurring. The creek was smaller now than it had been in 1924, tamed by decades of development upstream, but the water still moved with the same gentle persistence that had claimed a little boy nearly a century ago. Claire had carried Tommy's wooden boat, while Robert held the original wedding photograph. Patricia brought a small bouquet of wildflowers, and Eli carried a letter he had written, not to Tommy, but to his great-grandparents. Henry and Margaret, Eli had read aloud as the creek gurgled softly beside them. We want you to know that we understand now. We understand the love that made you want to protect each other from pain. We understand the guilt that made silence seem kinder than memory. But we also want you to know that Tommy was never forgotten, not really. He lived in Margaret's tears and Henry's quiet moments. He lived in the extra place at Christmas dinner and the toy soldier in a pocket. Today, we're bringing him back into the light where he belongs. Robert had knelt by the water's edge and gently placed the wooden boat into the current. Goodbye, Tommy, he whispered. I'm sorry I never got to be your little brother in life, but I promise you'll always be my big brother in memory. They had watched the little boat drift downstream until it disappeared around a bend, carrying with it a century of unspoken grief. Now, hours later, the exhibition was in full swing. Visitors moved from table to table, admiring the carefully curated collection of Wells family history. But the centerpiece, the thing that drew the most attention, was the restored 1923 wedding photograph, displayed in a place of honor with a brass plaque beneath it. The plaque read, Henry James Wells and Margaret Rose Wells, married June 15, 1923, with their son Thomas Henry Wells, 1921 to 1924. Our family stands complete in love and memory. Eli had spent days perfecting the restoration. Using the original photograph from Tommy's hidden room, he had carefully brought the little boy back into full visibility, reversing nearly a century of deliberate obscuration. Tommy stood between his parents now, clear and bright, his sailor suit pristine and his dark eyes sparkling with life. "It's remarkable," said Mrs. Henderson, a distant cousin who had traveled from Mumbai for the celebration. "The little boy looks so much like the rest of the Wells men. I can see the family resemblance clearly." "That's our Tommy," Claire said softly, her voice steady but warm. "He would have been my husband's older brother." Robert approached the display, carrying his own son, Eli's 5-year-old nephew, Jamie, on his shoulders. "Uncle Tommy," Robert said, pointing to the photograph, "was Grandpa's big brother. He loved toy boats and drawing pictures." Jamie studied the photograph with the serious concentration only children could muster. "Where is he now, Grandpa?" "He's wherever the people we love go when they can't be with us anymore," Robert replied. "But he's still part of our family." As the day progressed, something beautiful happened. Visitors began sharing their own stories of family losses, of relatives whose memories had been painful to preserve but too precious to lose. The exhibition became not just a celebration of the Wells family, but a reminder that every family carried both joy and sorrow, and that acknowledging both was what made them whole. Mrs. Chen, now using a walker but still sharp as ever, made her way to Eli during the afternoon. "You did the right thing, young man," she said, nodding toward the photograph. "That little boy has been waiting 100 years to stand with his family again." As the sun began to set and the last visitors departed, Eli found himself alone with the exhibition. He stood before Tommy's photograph, no longer seeing a mystery to be solved or a ghost to be feared, but simply a child who had been loved, lost, and finally found again. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Thank you for bringing our family home." Eli smiled, understanding for the first time that history wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about healing the present. Tommy Wells was no longer a buried secret or a source of shame. He was simply what he had always been, a beloved son, brother, and great-uncle whose short life had touched 4 generations of his family. The mystery that had begun with a ghostly figure in a photograph had ended with the child restored to his rightful place in the family story. And as Eli finally turned off the exhibition lights and locked the community center doors, he carried with him the knowledge that some secrets, when brought into the light with love and compassion, could transform from sources of pain into sources of healing. Tommy Wells was home at last.